Morning, everybody. My name is Tom Ballantyne. I'm the Vice President for Policy at NIOP Maryland. Today's webinar is dedicated to Maryland's climate goals and the statewide building energy performance standard. Your panelists are three of the most knowledgeable experts in climate mitigation and high performance buildings that you'll find anywhere in the country. NIOP's excited they've agreed to offer their insights and expertise today. The webinar breaks into three subject areas: the big picture context. This is an overview of Maryland's first in the nation climate goals. It will be presented by Michael Powell. Michael's a member of the Energy and Environmental Practice Group at Feinblatt. Since 2015, Michael's represented business interests on the State Climate Commission and is co-chair of the Commission's Mitigation Working Group. He's a former principal counsel to the Maryland Department of Environment and has advised a wide range of businesses on environmental permit and compliance issues. An introduction to the statewide building performance standard is the second piece, and it'll be presented by Chris Pendley. Chris is a senior building systems engineer at Stephen Winter Associates. He's developed and implemented a wide range of building performance projects, from large-scale retrofits to small-scale optimization measures in buildings. And he was part of the project team that delivered the Building Energy Performance Standard report for Montgomery County. The third piece and the cleanup batter is David Borchardt. He's going to present information on preparing to track and benchmark energy use. David's the senior mechanical engineer at Maryland Energy Advisors, where he leads redesign of existing HVAC systems for efficiency across a variety of building types. He's got 30 years of real estate experience, building, design, construction, operations experience, including a stint as a chief sustainability officer and project manager at tower companies, as well as a vice president for development at Lerner Enterprises. So these brief introductions just don't do justice to the experience of our panel. I'd recommend you review their bios along with the slide decks once the meeting materials are made available. And before I turn the screen over to Michael Powell, I'll just ask you to hold your questions to the end of the three presentations. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Let me just start my screen here. Hopefully you're all now seeing the title screen, Building Energy Performance Standards, the big picture. Hopefully we don't have any difficulty with the transmission this morning. I'm actually in Portugal at the moment. The library you saw behind me in the earlier screenshot is not in Portugal. It's in Dublin, but nevertheless, I'm sending this from overseas, so hopefully we go well. Chris and Dave are going to give you the details of what the draft regulations provide. I'm going to try to put it in context to give you an idea of where did they come from, where do I think they're going, why are we doing all of this in the first place. So don't blame me for it. But I will be able to give you some sense of what I see coming and where I think it's coming from. Let's see if I can get this there. The first thing you need to know is that Maryland has the most aggressive threshold requirements for climate change of any state in the country. Nobody else has a law requiring them to cut as much CO2 or CO2 equivalents as Maryland does. This is a list of what are considered the most aggressive states and those states which are our bordering states. See, Maryland's target put in statute is that we have to get a 60% reduction in CO2 compared to a 1996 level by 2031 and reach net zero carbon emissions by 2045. California, which people normally assume is the most aggressive state in the country, in fact only has a 40% target by 2030. New York, another state which are considered to be a very aggressive targets, is also at only 40% by 2030 and also only has a 85% reduction, not a net zero or carbon neutral standard, out at 2050. Massachusetts, which some people think we're trying to one-up California, they have a 50% by 2030. So Maryland has the most aggressive standard, and obviously places like California and New York have a lot more resources to spend at the problem or to throw at the problem. Our neighboring states are nowhere near as aggressive as we are. Virginia has no 2030 target at all. Pennsylvania has a target, but it's only 26%, not 60. Delaware's in the same ballpark. West Virginia, of course, has no target at all. So this aggressive timeline is what has led to the requirements that you're going to see on the building energy performance standards. Historically, this is a chart showing what our CO2 equivalent emissions have been, and then a projection of what we need to achieve in order to comply with the statute. The solid blue bars are the CO2 inventory. CO2, when I say CO2, it includes CO2 equivalents like methane. The blue dotted line is what the statute requires us to achieve by 2031. The green dotted line is the slope we'd have to achieve to get net zero by 2045. When I first show this chart, most people look at it and say, well, we're right on target. We're meeting that standard, so we just need to continue doing what we're doing. But that's very misleading. Most of the reduction you see between 2006 and 2020 is really the result of two issues, both of which were essentially no cost reductions in CO2. First, we switched from coal to natural gas as the major source of our electric power. It didn't cost us nearly as much as you would think because we discovered that we can get natural gas from shale oil. And therefore, we suddenly had a very abundant, very cheap cost of natural gas. So we could switch from coal to natural gas, save tremendous amount of CO2 without a great deal of cost. Secondly, we passed laws requiring cars to meet much tighter mileage standards. Though that meant the cars became more expensive, there was, of course, a tremendous saving in gasoline being consumed. So as a result, that came at a relatively low cost. Those low-hanging fruit are gone. To achieve the kind of numbers that we've got to achieve under the statute, you have to use increasingly expensive measures and increasingly difficult measures. Let me give you a sense of how that works. This is a very complicated slide, and I apologize for that, but it's really the heart of the issue that you need to understand. The outer ring is the inventory of CO2 as compiled in 2020 by the Department of the Environment. The middle ring is sort of categories. So 18.4 in the top right corner, that's the amount of CO2 or CO2 equivalents produced by burning gasoline on road, cars, gasoline powered trucks, that kind of thing on road. 29.8 is summing all the transportation sources. The 36 you see there in red is the reduction that the statute requires us to make by 2031. Again, the most aggressive standard of any state in the country. You can see just at a glance that you're not going to get that from any one category. Even if you somehow waved a magic wand and took every gasoline-powered car and truck off the road today, you still would only have achieved about half of the reduction that the statute requires us to reach by 2031. So you're not going to get it from one area. Some people come in and say, well, we need to eliminate all the coal plants. Well, they're all scheduled to close by 2025 right now. But coal is that little 3.9 down at the bottom of the screen. So even if you eliminate that, you're not going to make much of a dent in the 36. And as with most of the items on this chart, when you say you're going to eliminate it, what are you substituting for it? Most of the replacement for the 3.9 of coal has been natural gas. Natural gas produces only about 60% of the CO2 of coal. So we get a big benefit when coal plants are replaced by natural gas plants, but it doesn't go away. Similarly, if you look at the 18.4 for cars, Maryland has signed into law a requirement that we convert to all electric vehicles. After about 2035, you will not be able to buy a gasoline-powered car, new gasoline-powered car in Maryland. But the average car stays on the road for about 15 years, according to Car and Driver. So even 15 years from now, you got to expect that at least half and probably more of the cars on the road will be gasoline powered. So to get 36 out of that, a million metric tons out of that outer ring is going to require taking something from every category. And that's why we have building energy performance standards being proposed by the Department of the Environment, because that purple area, that 10.9, which is buildings, is a category that, though it's much smaller than some of the others, is still a part of what they need to get, and if they're going to meet these very stringent requirements of the statute. So what does the Climate Solutions Now Act do? How does it get to those numbers? In concept, it's really very simple. It's let's switch everything to electricity. Let's eliminate all burning of fossil fuels. Let's try to eliminate as much as we physically can, gasoline, diesel, fuel oils, natural gas, propane, everything you can imagine that'd be natural gas, and instead power it off of electricity. And then let's try to convert the electricity to renewable or clean energy, solar, wind, hydro. In concept, that all works, right? If everything was being powered purely by electricity and the electricity was produced by non-carbon sources, you can eliminate all CO2 from the economy. But we're doing that, a very difficult transition to make. We're doing it with a very incredibly tight timeline, that is to meet the 2031 standard. And we're talking about trying to totally convert by 2045. So if I haven't scared you yet, then I'm not doing this right, because this is a near impossible task, but the state is trying to take us down that road. As I said, Dave and Chris are going to walk you through the details of what the building energy performance standards do, but let me tell you what the four primary categories are, just to fit it in context. Because not all of these are in the building energy performance. These are some additional requirements that are going to go along with it. First, you're going to see lots of changes in building codes. Expect that the building codes are going to be requiring more efficient buildings, and in fact, they're going to phase out new buildings being reliant upon fossil fuel. In the building energy performance standards, you're going to see mandates on reductions in direct greenhouse gas emissions. That's burning of fossil fuel at the building. Things like natural gas boilers or propane heating. You're going to see that go considerably reduced. Third, as part of the building energy performance standards, you're going to see requirements to improve efficiencies of the building, so that even if there are no CO2 being produced at the building, the concept is that they'll use less energy. And if that energy is partially produced by fossil fuel sources, you reduce the fossil fuel that way. And then lastly, you're going to see requirements that we're already seeing them at the single family level, but it's going to spread, that buildings to have the ability to charge electric vehicles. So let me walk through some of these very quickly to give you the context. But before I go through some of those and where I think it's going to go after this, let me point out what impact this will have on natural gas. Because we're going to be talking a lot about regulations forcing you to shift off of natural gas, but there's also an impact of this on cost, and the cost of natural gas may force people to convert as well. This is a chart that a group of consultants prepared for the Department of the Environment to project, to the extent you can project, what the cost of natural gas would be. The four different colors talk about different scenarios for how aggressive the state will be in moving off of natural gas. The green area, that range, was what the Department of the Environment and the Maryland Climate Change Commission originally conceived, which is that people would be forced to rely upon, at least in new construction, on heat pumps for primary heating, but would be allowed to use things like natural gas, propane, heating oil as backup. In other words, you have the heat pump, but you'd have the assistance of a backup power system. As you can see, even under that scenario, we get very significant increases in the cost of natural gas starting around 2035. However, as these regulations have developed, it looks more and more as if we're going to end up with a high electrification scenario. That's a scenario where the regulations are pretty much stopping you from using even fossil fuel, even as a backup heating source. Um, what happens here is that as you put fewer and fewer people on the natural gas system, it means that fewer and fewer people have to bear the overhead cost of maintaining those pipelines. Obviously, a natural gas pipeline is a lot of maintenance cost. You can't afford to have any leaks. You can't afford to have any loss of natural gas. So the cost of maintaining the system falls upon fewer people as you have fewer customers. As you have fewer customers and the costs go up, more people drop off because once the cost of natural gas starts to climb, more and more people switch to electric heat pumps. So you get a loop going on. And that's what causes, starting around 2035, the price of natural gas to go near vertical. So even if the regulations don't force you off fossil fuel, you can expect that the price may do so. So if you're working on new buildings and you're looking at a building to have a 40, 50 year life, don't expect that you're going to be able to maintain heating with fossil fuel. But these are what you're doing with building energy performance standards. When you go back to this number, you can see that even with the eliminating all of the buildings, eliminating all of the transportation, maybe you'll get to that 36, but the law requires us to reach net zero by 2045. Net zero means that we have to eliminate that 49 that's in black as well. So even when you take all of the draft regulations they're proposing, all of the building energy performance standards, it does not get us there. And in fact, the state hired the University of Maryland to do something called a pathway report that said, how do we reach net zero? Not just how do we reach this 2031 standard, but how do we reach the standard for 2045? And the state is proposing in their early draft stages, early discussion stages, the additional measures that will be required to eliminate that other 49. Let me describe some of those standards. Again, this gets a little more speculative. It's not in the draft regulations. It's what I see coming after the draft regulations. This gives you a concept of what is needed. This is from the pathway report prepared by the University of Maryland. The green line, the solid green line, is the path we would need to reach in order to get to net zero, or approximately net zero by 2045. This measures the total emissions. You would be able to reduce those numbers by offsets, but we need to follow the green line. The dotted line is what the current policies in the draft regulations and adopted would get us. That includes things like banning gasoline-powered cars, California car requirements. That includes the current building energy performance standard draft that you're going to hear about. That includes a wide variety of other requirements, including clean trucks being proposed. That gets you the dotted line. You can see in 2031 the gap between where the green line needs us to be under the statute and the dotted line of what our current policies are is not too big, but there is a gap there. But obviously, by the time you get out to 2045, we fall very low. So that's why I'm predicting that the department is going to be proposing much more comprehensive, much more stringent requirements. And in fact, the pathway report says that the current building energy performance standard regulations in draft form would only cut emissions by about 20%, and they're proposing that we adopt additional policies to cut another 15%. So again, what you're going to hear about today, as drastic as it sounds, is probably only the first round. What do I see coming next? The pathway report's got a number of proposals, and these are not even in draft yet, but they're proposals about what the state needs to do in order to get that additional 15%. The first thing coming up is something called clean heat standards. The building energy performance standards goes at it on a building by building basis and says, how do we cut emissions from this building, or how do we make these buildings more efficient? The clean heat standards, which Department of the Environment is working on, will approach it from an appliance standpoint. It'll be designed to force you to have more efficient appliances, or in most cases, force you to use electric appliances rather than natural gas, fuel oil, or propane appliances. So expect that coming from that line. Secondly, the Public Service Commission is likely to adopt restrictions on new natural gas hookups. They may eventually look at something more comprehensive, but I think the first round will be making it very hard to hook up a building to natural gas. So if you've got a plot of land and you're looking at putting a building there, don't assume just because there's a natural gas pipeline out front that you'll be able to get a hookup. Some of the local building codes are going even further, and they're simply banning all new hookups. We've seen that in some other states. There are about 20 cities across the country, most of them in California, that have banned new hookups. But it does look like something that's coming this way. In addition to the clean heat standards, I do expect there will eventually be air pollution laws about natural gas stoves. That's a very hot political item right now. You'll see lots of people swear that it's not going to happen. I've been around here long enough to read the tea leaves. I think it is coming. And then this is an interesting one. There is already discussion within the Maryland Energy Administration and among the advocates to extend the building energy performance standards to buildings smaller than 25,000 square foot. As you'll hear shortly, currently the drafts only talk about larger buildings, but I think that that will be extended. There's also additional requirements coming that are non-building. The one that is, I think, furthest out there, but nevertheless is a very serious proposal being discussed by the Department of the Environment and is in the pathway report, is something called a cap and invest, where it's basically just a carbon tax with a proviso that any taxes collected have to be spent on either reductions in CO2 or environmental justice. This sounds very radical. The problem is that the pathway report by the University of Maryland says we cannot achieve the statutory standards unless this is adopted. That's what's giving this legs. It's also why I testified against the standards that are in the Climate Solutions Now Act. I thought they were too aggressive. But once you adopt those standards in the statute, you have to look at things like cap and invest, additional renewable energy, right? To get to 100% clean electricity, you've got to greatly increase the amount of solar development in particular that we're doing in the state of Maryland. Because remember, the sun doesn't always shine. So you've got to have a lot of solar farms in order to generate the amount of electricity that you have to store for those peak periods. Maryland currently is what is known as a summer peak. We use the most electricity during a hot summer afternoon and everybody turns on their air conditioners. Once you go over to an entirely clean system where you are using heat pumps and not fossil fuel to heat buildings, we become a winter peak state. Biggest demand is in the middle of a very cold February night when, of course, there is no sunlight. So that's going to be a massive shift of alone. BG&E says they're going to need something like 200 new substations simply to handle the grid changes. There's going to be changes. The Greenhouse Gas Initiative is a regional requirement. We're going to see pressure to try to force the region as a whole to shift to solar and electric. Particular interest to those of you who build buildings, there are going to be proposals to switch non-road use to electric. It's going to start with things like leaf blowers. You're already seeing some activity on that in Montgomery County, but I do expect there'll be proposals to force all lawnmowers and eventually even construction equipment to switch to electric rechargeable alternatives. Look, this is the big question. We're pushing everything off onto electricity, and I apologize for all the words on this slide, but this is a very tough issue. Can the grid really handle the load, right? We're talking about winter peaks. We're talking about a grid system that was designed where you'd have a massive coal plant like the Brandon Shores power plant along the Baltimore Beltway at the center of a grid that looks like a spider web. Massive power lines coming out of the coal burning power plant, spreading out and getting smaller and smaller as you move further away from the power plant, but centered on the power plant. Now we're going to a system where that power plant's closed. It's due to close in 2025. And suddenly what we have is scattered around the outside edges of the spider web. We have these smaller producing solar farms. And we're now going to try to somehow import those intermittent sun-only power plants power into the municipal areas which are near the centers of the grid. That's a massive change, even if you weren't trying to change the generating sources of power. And this is going to be a rough ride. PJM is the group which coordinates our regional grid. Its original name was Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland, but now they're much larger, many more states in it. They coordinate how the grid power flows in the grid across much of the northeast of the U.S. They have concluded that when the coal burning power plants close in 2025, we will have a high risk of brownouts and blackouts. What does that mean in power speak? It means there won't be sufficient reserve capacity to satisfy them that the issues are being addressed. They think by 2028, maybe we can build enough transmission lines to bring in enough extra power from outside the state to meet that requirement. Maybe if we can raise $700 million from ratepayers to pay for the additional transmission. So expect this to be a tough transition. And again, this is only the first wave of things that I expect. That's in a nutshell the context. I'm going to let Chris and Dave talk to you about exactly what the building energy performance standards come from or provide, but this gives you a sense of where they come from. I will be back in the country shortly, but in the meantime, my email is here. Feel free to email me if you have any questions. And Tom, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks very much, Michael. And really appreciate you making the time on your vacation to be with us today. Before I turn it over to Chris, I'll just give you a programming note. Those of you that are online, if you can plan to stay a few minutes over 10 o'clock, please do that. Also, if you have questions, put them in the chat. We'll get to questions at the end of the three presentations to the extent that we can. And what we can't get to, we will answer in writing and distribute out to the attendees. So with that, I'll just turn it over to Chris Pendley, who's going to talk about the components of the draft Maryland Building Energy Performance Standard. Chris?
Cool, yeah, thanks Tom, Tim, and Michael. Yeah, so again, Chris Pendley with Stephen Winter Associates, and Michael gave us an overview of the overall legislative landscape. At this point, we're going to dive straight into the legislation and talk about what's going on with the Climate Solutions Now Act and kind of introduce you to what the shape of Maryland's building energy performance standards look like. So as Tom mentioned earlier, I'm a senior building systems engineer with Stephen Winter Associates. If you haven't heard of us, that's okay. We've been around for about 50 years. We do kind of a whole lot of different things. I'm out of our DC office. We have offices also in New York and Connecticut, Boston. So kind of what I work on, as Tom mentioned, right, is I do a lot with existing buildings, especially around conservation management, decarbonization, and also a little bit on the policy side. So if you're familiar with Montgomery County BEPS, which we're not really going to talk about here, but the shape of it is going to look really familiar when you're looking at Maryland BEPS. I did a lot of work with Montgomery County, so it kind of made sense for me to also talk a little bit about the Maryland BEPS. Yeah, so the Maryland BEPS contains a couple of different components, and I want to touch on both of them briefly. One is around benchmarking requirements, and David's going to get more details on that. And then kind of getting into the building performance standards. Kind of as we go through this, I'm also going to highlight like some things that we've learned from other jurisdictions. So DC also has a building energy performance standard. It's benchmarking requirements, so we can kind of pick up some lessons learned from what we're seeing there, as well as kind of where we may run across questions or things that might require some additional clarification. And we'll kind of highlight those as we go through. So if you've never heard of benchmarking, The legislation requires you to benchmark starting in 2026 with third-party verified 2025 data, and you use Portfolio Manager for it. At a very basic level, you take space use data, utility data. You're going to have some form of supplemental data. Normally, we'll see that as a tax ID number, and kind of all of that stuff goes into Portfolio Manager. And that's going to be the platform that you use, which is a very common platform. If you've ever done a benchmark program, they pretty much all use Portfolio Manager. So that's a very, very, very brief introduction. But it actually, in a way, gets at one of our first questions, and it's kind of a weird question to think about. But hey, what's a building? We think of a building in a lot of cases as just kind of the totally separate thing, right? We have all of our incoming utility power that goes straight to this building that is physically separate from anything else around it. And yes, that's a building. That one's pretty straightforward. But there are some cases where it can be less obvious. So, for example, if you have, one meter service that serves 5 separate freestanding buildings, for benchmarking purposes, that's actually one building because you have 1 meter that serves all of those properties. And the inverse of that can also be true sometimes too. So, for example, kind of the one that pops in my head is a garden style multifamily property where, let's say, you think of the property as having, the property has 10 little complexes, right? And you think of those 10 together for kind of your internal purposes, but maybe they all have separate metering systems. Maybe they all have their own individual electric meters, or maybe there's one gas meter for each of the buildings. Maybe there's a water meter for each of the buildings. And so when we think about that in terms of benchmarking, we'd actually benchmark all of those separately. So for this program, it's actually 10 buildings, not just one. So kind of one of the first questions to think about as you're starting to think through benchmarking is, okay, what's my building? So all of those things go into benchmarking. And then the next thing that would have to happen here is a third-party verification. This may be a new thing for a lot of people. The first third-party verification cycle coming up in the area is going to be with Washington, D.C., starting in 2024 with 2023 calendar year data. So what does that mean? Third-party verification, kind of colloquially, is the act of somebody who isn't the owner or the benchmarking provider for a property reviewing all of the data that we just talked about in Portfolio Manager, comparing to existing documentation, and making sure the entry is correct. And we kind of also hit our first major question, right? What does MDE call a third-party verifier? They haven't formally defined it yet. And we have a couple of different scenarios here. So in DC, Department of Energy and Environment, or DOE, takes a hard line around this third-party verifier where it can't be an employee of the benchmarking company. In Montgomery County, their Department of Environmental Protection, or DEP, takes a slightly different tack. And they define third-party verifier a little more colloquially as somebody who isn't involved with the day-to-day benchmarking of the property. So, for example, if you have, at your company, you have 3 people who deal with benchmarking day in, day out, but they all have their own fully isolated portfolios, right? Somebody who deals with like Portfolio 1 could verify, somebody's building in Portfolio 2 or Portfolio 3. So we're not quite sure yet how MDE is going to define that. So that's kind of a thing to keep an eye on. But regardless, the actions are going to be similar. You collect this information, compare it to what's there. If you need to make adjustments or corrections, you make the adjustments and corrections, report back to the verifier, and the verifier reviews the data to make sure that it's correct. Now, there are going to be some exemptions. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but there are exemptions for low occupancy. Commercial food services are exempted. If you have EV charging that is separately metered, that also gets exempted. And again, David's going to go through benchmarking in more details, but I did want to touch on this briefly because benchmarking feeds the active building performance standard. And before we get into the specifics for Maryland BEPS, what is a building performance standard in the first place, right? So at a very basic level, a building performance standard is just a long-term performance target for the building stock in a given area or given region. There's a bunch of different ways you can define that standard. In DC, we're kind of defining it, building energy performance standards are defined around Energy Star scores and site EUI. In Montgomery County, they're defined around site EUI. For Maryland, they're defined around site EUI and greenhouse gas emissions. But at a very general level, like the building performance standards could be any or all of these things, or even other things. You can even have a building performance standard around peak demand. but I haven't actually seen one of those. But in theory, it is possible. So with that being said, right, Maryland BEPS looks at two things: looks at site EUI and on-site greenhouse gas. And we'll get into some specifics, but kind of to just reset, what is the overall shape of this approach? It's what we call a trajectory approach, where kind of all of your building type, all of kind of a given building type ends up with the same site EUI and the same greenhouse gas reduction, but kind of where you start just depends on where your building is today. And the closer you are to that final standard, right, the less you'll have to do. The further away you are, the more you'll have to do. And the other piece here is this is the site EUI target, right? So you can see the axis here is around site EUI, but we also have this greenhouse gas component kind of tacked onto it. So the other piece here, right, is by 2040, this on-site greenhouse gas number, 0. So, lesson 2, right? If we're putting in new equipment and new gas-fired equipment or new fossil fuel equipment, in the next couple of years, we may have to pull that equipment out before the end of its useful life. So I would think very strongly about putting in new fossil fuel equipment, even today, given this 2040 standard. And so let's kind of overlay our benchmarking requirements now with what we know about Maryland BEPS. And we kind of have these different targets, right? We have this 5-year third-party verification effort that happens. We have these on-site greenhouse gas reduction items that we kind of had on the previous slide. And the other piece is kind of this what we call a straight line trajectory between our baseline site EUI and our final site EUI. We draw those lines at 1/3 and 2/3 of the way. Now, again, we do have some exemptions today. Commercial cooking is probably the exemption that, a fair amount of y'all deal with. There's also a bunch of building types that are currently exempted, including industrial, schools, again, like big commercial kitchens. And then the other big one is going to be buildings under 35,000 square feet. So at a very basic level, how do we connect these? How do we connect to this benchmarking requirement to this building energy performance standard? Well, first off, right, we verify our 2025 energy data. We do this thing where we're weighting our EUI targets based on space types, and then you get your building-specific trajectory from it. That's kind of an obtuse thing to get your head around. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you an example. So our example is going to be just very basic 100,000 square foot building. It's going to, let's say, that's a site EUI of 100 kBtu per square foot, and it has a greenhouse gas emissions intensity of 1 kilogram of CO2 per square foot. And this is just, again, an illustrative example to help us figure out, all right, what do our standards look like? What sorts of things do we have to do? So this is our mystery building that, but depending on what's in the building, right, the work we might have to do varies quite a bit. So if it is, so for example, if it's like a multifamily property, just to pick one at random, right, we have, we're kind of right on that 20%, 60%, 100% reduction trajectory in terms of CO, and so we can kind of tie that directly to kind of our emissions reductions. But now we have very aggressive site EUI targets given that. If the building was 100,000 square foot medical office building, all of a sudden we have a whole lot of stuff we need to do with gas, but we don't have as much to do with site EUI. And then if we're like an office, right, again, very similar story to the medical office building. We have a more aggressive site EUI target to get to. And then, for example, if we're a hotel, we're actually in good shape for the first greenhouse gas standard target. And then, but we have more to do here, and then we have some site EUI work that we'd have to look at doing. So where do these targets come from, right? They're based on a couple of things. They're based on voluntary benchmarking data for the state of Maryland that MDE used to help set these standards. And then there's some target setting methodology they used based on the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance tool. And that tool is a pretty flexible tool. We use the tool also with Montgomery County. It can do a lot of different things. Probably the most useful thing it can do is set EUI targets for different typologies. And that's what they did here. I haven't seen it under the hood, so I don't know the specifics of how they went about doing it. There are some different ways you can do this. One thing I'm reasonably confident of is that they did anticipate electrifying all loads, because again, right, we're electrifying all loads as part of the greenhouse gas component. of the legislation. The other thing that I want to notice, just to kind of give you a prep, right? These are linear reductions, right? Linear reductions over here, and then linear reductions over here. In reality, the building reductions that you'll have to take are going to be a bit chunkier because they're going to be project-based, right? So maybe you would have to convert your space heating from gas-fired boilers to maybe like an air-to-water heat pump, right? That's not really a linear reduction. That's a change one big thing and then go to this other more efficient thing. And that has a big impact on the on-site greenhouse gas emissions and a big impact on your site on your site UI. But it's not going to be like a linear 5-year improvement. It's going to be you're here and then you convert it and it goes there. Another piece to point out is that there are way more space types in this in the actual rulemaking. If I was going to put standards for going to do this for every single building, this would be like 6 slides on its own. Maybe 6 slides with very small font. But to go back to our site example, right? This is assuming that all of our building is the same space type. What if we have multiple space types in our building? Let's say, for example, we take this building and now it's half office and half multifamily. So what you do in this scenario as you're trying to figure out your building targets is you weight your targets based on the amount of, you weight your targets based on the percentage of floor area of your various space types. So we made our lives easy. We said the building's half office, half multifamily. So we basically, in our case, find the midpoint between these two items, right? And so our actual target and trajectory for our 50% office, 50% multifamily building looks like this line, this bolded line down here. So in this case, right, what does that tell us? This tells us that we have a lot of work to do over the next 15 years. And you could have more than 2 space types. You could have 6 or 7 space types. We just did 2 space types to make the example a little bit easier to follow. So that's a lot, right? What if I don't do anything, right? What does that look like? So there are penalties, or I think they're called alternative compliance payments. And we kind of have these compliance payments are twofold. There are greenhouse gas penalties that are based on the social cost of carbon. They're per metric ton of CO2 emitted. They are annual payments, and they start at $230 per metric ton of CO2, and they increase by at least $4 a year. And that starts in 2030. And that's the greenhouse gas component. The other component, which is probably the one that got your attention, is the site UI penalty based on kind of existing air quality civil penalties. And that can be up to $25,000 a day. Now, with that being said, we do not know how this is actually going to be enforced. For example, in Washington, D.C., the performance pathway, which is a site UI reduction pathway, has a fine of $10 a square foot if you do nothing on the pathway. But that fine is reduced based on your progress towards the targets. So there are various scenarios where I could see MDE considering doing something like that. That sort of thing kind of makes sense. We don't know if it's going to be a daily levied penalty, but I do want to make you aware that there are 2 different approaches here to there's kind of the greenhouse gas payment piece, and then there's the site UI piece. So there are potentials for 2 different alternative compliance payments in this scenario. Yeah, so that's kind of BEPS, right? So now kind of talking through what the legislation looks like, the next question comes up. All right, cool. Well, great. What do I do? What does this process look like at a high level? So at a high level, what we've seen kind of across our region is kind of this 5-step scenario. And obviously step 1 is going to be looking at benchmarking. So basically, right, we have to have our portfolio manager data in by the end of 2025 so we can do third-party verification before 2026. What that also means is if we wait until the end, wait until that compliance deadline, then we don't know where we're at until we actually get our information in the portfolio manager, because we don't have a benchmark to work from. So it actually makes a lot of sense to get your building information in the portfolio manager. Honestly, you can start today. David's going to go through some details on this. And then look at making sure that data is correct. So great, we have a benchmark. What do we need to do, right? So then we need to identify, start putting some bounds around our plan, right? Where do we use greenhouse gas on site today? what's that site EUI target for our property? Do we have renovation schedules coming up where we're already going to be doing a bunch of mechanical work or a bunch of envelope work at a property? How can we potentially align those with these targets? Once we kind of have those pieces pulled together, we can look at conducting a building assessment. And we'd anticipate that most buildings need an assessment of some sort. The specifics will vary a little bit by building. So you want to look, that kind of assessment needs to look at ideally optimizing what you have, the equipment you have, gets you a plan to off-ramp from on-site greenhouse gas emissions, and also identifies what else is going to be needed to hit our site UI targets. One thing that I do want to give you a heads up on is sometimes just off-ramping from on-site greenhouse gas emissions reductions may not be enough to get us to your site UI targets. So you're probably going to need to look at something on the electric efficiency side as well. So once you have a plan, right, all of this stuff is going to be a few years out, but we do want to make you aware of it, right? Have a plan, conduct an assessment based on the assessment, run through measure implementation, make sure that the measure implementation is commissioned properly, and the people who will be operating the building know how to operate the equipment that you're putting in. Because one thing we don't want to do here, right, is spend a whole lot of effort getting the building up to a good standard. Putting in very efficient equipment, and then not having people in the building who don't necessarily know how to run it correctly. So we all of a sudden lose a lot of this efficiency, and now we're running the risk of getting penalties by doing it. Run the risk of penalties as a result of that. And we can do that with a good commissioning effort, a good training effort, and making sure that we're tracking performance. So yeah, that's a lot, right? The last thing that we're going to cover briefly is kind of what have we learned from other regions. So there's a lot of kind of consternation. We're going to process with DC around, okay, what does third-party verification look like? Why do we need to do this? Honestly, what Steve Winter Associates has found is that most benchmarking entries we reviewed have something wrong with them. That something could be small. That something could be very large. Like, oh, your portfolio manager entry says you have 100 bedrooms, but based on this other information you gave us, you have 150. That's a small change. Or, hey, you have your building listed at 75,000 square feet. And based on these drawings, 155,000 square feet. That's a big difference. Getting that stuff right the first time makes your life easier. Similarly, 2040 is a ways away unless you're thinking in terms of equipment replacement. Or putting a piece of equipment in today, it may still be there in 15 years, or it may still be there in 20 years. So thinking about our 2040 compliance plans as we run through equipment replacements now makes a lot of sense. Kind of bears in with that, right, is avoiding new fossil fuel installations. Because I would have concerns that equipment would need to be replaced before the end of its useful life. It would effectively be throwing good money after bad in that scenario. Another piece that I want to highlight is kind of, this is going to be a new process for a lot of people. And we're going to see details change. I don't expect the shape of the legislation to change, but I would expect some of the details to change. I would expect that, for example, maybe some of the targets get looked at once mandatory benchmarking comes in. I would expect that it may take a little bit of time for the utilities to get everything fully pulled together that they need to have pulled together based on the regulation. So there are going to be pieces that are a little bit, that will be uneven. It's going to happen. Just be patient. We will figure this all out together. And yeah, so what do we do next, right? So start getting stuff together to benchmark. And David's going to talk about what that stuff needs to look like. Once you have that benchmark and once you have that plan together, start with that roadmap. And again, all right, don't put in new fossil fuel. If you get anything out of this presentation, please get that out. And then again, we'll see some regulatory adjustments. Just keep an eye out for them. And yeah, kind of I did a lot with Montgomery County regulations. We can help with a lot of these pieces. So just if there are questions, feel free to contact me. Cool. Thank you all.
Thanks, Chris. We'll move it on directly to David Borchardt, who's going to talk about what to think about now for implementation and benchmarking at the building level. David?
All right. Good morning, everybody. So I wanted to kind of start out with just a little bit of my background because it kind of puts a relevance to this. I started, been working on the development community, building design, construction, financing, everything related to buildings. So I started out my whole benchmarking journey when I knew Montgomery County and DC were looking into the regulations. So started benchmarking quite a while ago and realizing the impact an individual developer can have by giving input. So where are we today? You know, I want to know what's going on. The regulations are not finalized, but there will be penalties, as people have said, for noncompliance. Eventually, there will be a cost for not achieving goals starting in 2030. Okay. I know people have shown some pretty big numbers. I wouldn't panic about that. I would, if you're benchmarking, there are going to be a lot of people out there, a good number who haven't even benchmarked by the time they're required to. So all buildings to eliminate fossil fuel use by 2040 is probably a reality. Up to a point, there will be buildings that can't. There might be critical infrastructure. But I want to make a point. There's another opportunity to submit comments when the proposed regulations are published. So Maryland has not finalized the regulations yet. Your input is essential at this point. So all this, everything that's happening, yes, will be a reality, but you can tweak it and move the direction. So what are the Maryland requirements as of the moment? All covered buildings that have a gross floor area of 35,000 square feet. Now, one thing I would do, and one thing I started doing, is I wasn't paying as much attention to the square footage because I realized there's a likelihood, just like Montgomery County has done, they will probably be reducing that square footage. There'll probably be some tiered levels over the years. So I would benchmark as many of your facilities as is feasible because you'll be better prepared in the future. You must benchmark using Portfolio Manager, which is a free tool that is available. And there are a lot of resources and organizations such as ours and Steve Winters who can help you with that. The first reporting year.
David, we're not seeing your slides. Is that?
Oh, you aren't? Oh, they were. Oh,
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh,
Tim,
no,
post
please.
And run them, or you can do it from your end.
No, let me, if I thought I saw something, can you spot it from my end or no, I'll run them.
Okay.
Let me.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, I'm glad.
That on.
Absolutely. Let me make sure I'm sharing the right slides. Can you see them now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. So, quickly, since I didn't actually talk about this slide, just Maryland Energy Advisors helps with a lot of these services. I just talked about this. So I'm going to skip. So you must benchmark using Portfolio Manager, which is a free tool. The first reporting year is 2024. Data reported in 2025. I would start getting prepared now because once you get your data in, it's a lot easier to start getting your data and understanding where you're getting the data from. And as Chris said, there's a lot of checking to make sure you put your data in accurately into the system. And it sometimes takes a year or two to make sure everything you're getting in there right. The building operating hours, the number of people in the building, and the state will establish standards and goals. One thing I want to point out is every county has property that is covered. Every legislative district has properties that are covered. You have a voice in this. If you're hearing something or realize something is going to cause an unnecessary economic burden to your company, Talk to your legislators. Talk to your state senators. Talk to your local representatives. They will listen. That's important. From my experience, when Montgomery County and DC were considering these regulations, there were certain things in them that did not work, that were a bit onerous, and we did change the direction. It might have not been in the first year, but it was in the subsequent years. So you have a voice in this. Be aware of that. But I'm now going to kind of change focus a little bit to what are the benefits of benchmarking, because there are benefits. You can't manage what you don't measure. So if you begin to measure your energy use, there are a lot of benefits for this. So benchmarking is a measure, for those who are not familiar, from 0 to 100. It's a percentage of where you fit within your building type, whether it be an office or multifamily. And in fact, now even auto dealerships can benchmark of where you fit. A building that ranks a 50 is an average building in the United States. You can compare similar building types. You can establish a reference performance level, and you can develop an action plan. We don't know what levels are going to be required in Maryland, but the sooner you benchmark your buildings and get them in there before 2026, as Chris recommended, the better it's going to be for your buildings, because you'll be in the database that the state is going to use to set the baselines for all the buildings. So you can establish a baseline for your buildings for energy, and even if you want to go for water to start saving money, compare current use. You can compare against national averages. You can see where you set. You can set targets. You can compare properties in a portfolio together. I'm assuming some people on the call are from national companies who probably benchmark already and know where their buildings stand, or even if they don't, they should know where their buildings stand, and you can compare a building in Florida to a building in Chicago. It allows you to do that. So what information do I need to provide? Property name and address, the total gross floor area of the property, the irrigated area, the year built, all these things. These is a whole list of data. So where do I get this list of data? Portfolio Manager has a site and where to get started, and you can you start with the country. A lot of countries actually use Portfolio Manager, property type, and you can add subtypes to it, and it will give you a printout of a list of questions. This is just the first page of 6 pages for a typical office building. So, but it will give you what pages you need, what data you need, and how to collect that data. There are ways to put it in spreadsheets, which is something we do, to upload in a bulk upload. So even though everybody talks about energy use, it's not just energy use. There's a lot of other data that goes in there to make sure you have accurate numbers. So you collect your data, and you have everything in there, even if there's a restaurant, unconditioned area, workers, number of computers, and you get your score and you also get your energy use intensity. EUI, which we've all talked about a little bit, is how much energy your building uses per square foot. Energy use intensity. It's measured in BTUs. It's a measure, just something to be aware of. So then you get your results. And this is kind of interesting. These are 2 multifamily buildings built around 2 years apart, both over between 100 and 150,000 square feet, operated by the same developer with the same basic systems in the building. And you can see we have a 29 on one and a 77 on another. They haven't had any major upgrades since they were built in the 80s. It just shows the difference in how you operate your buildings can make a huge difference in your score. So This is an advantage of Energy Star. And when this developer found this out, they realized they had an issue that they were not actually aware of. Because of the building size differences, the bills weren't as far apart as they're, large buildings, and they weren't as far apart as they would have expected. Score wise they were, but cost wise they were not. So it was kind of interesting to see where you are with this. So don't be surprised if you have similar buildings that you think are operating similarly that are not. So, and this is just by improving your operations. So we've also talked a lot about site EUI versus source EUI. So I wanted to kind of give a quick graphic so people understand that. Your site EUI is the energy you use on your site, the net greenhouse gas carbon emissions of your building, regardless of what the power, if the power plant providing your building or power plants in PJM, which is our local, which is our regional utility supplier, is gas fired or coal fired, whatever percentage that is, does not matter. It's your building energy use. It doesn't necessarily mean if you have a fully electrified building today, you're in good shape. But it does mean that if you need to pay attention to what you're doing at your building. And there are some conversations going on now, is if a site has solar, does that help offset some of the EUI? And there are some questions about how that works and whether it will benefit or not benefit a building. So I benchmark, what are my next steps? As Chris said, and I'm recommending, check your data for errors, changes, and inaccuracies. A lot of people put in their square footage of an office building or a multifamily, and they just are looking at the rentable square footage, not necessarily the gross. Regularly update your data. Hopefully somebody's going to start holding the utilities responsible for updating the data and getting it uploaded to get that data in accurately, but you need to check that utility data to make sure it's accurate. And then share your facility with the state benchmarking authority when it's required. There's a link on Portfolio Manager that allows you to do that. That's probably the easiest part of this whole process. So what do you do once you have this information? Well, there are a lot of no-cost tools for efficiency that are available. So you can develop new lease standards for efficiency. If you have tenant interiors or you have multifamily, when you do turnover, there are things you can do in the units. There are things utilities will support you at to help you make your building more efficient. Build into the rules, but work with tenants on energy data. A lot of industrial owners work with their industrial tenants, not just to reduce their energy use, but to make the buildings more efficient, to help them understand what they can do. Educate your tenants and offer resources. Understand what you can do within your budget. You have building maintenance costs built in. There's a lot you can do to replace equipment. We've all been in buildings that have a lot of fluorescent lights and they have cases and cases of them. And somebody decided we're not going to change till LEDs until we get rid of all these fluorescents. Well, that's not probably the way to go nowadays. So this gives you an idea, but it's not just that. You can take a poor performing building, as we saw in that earlier number, make it a high performing building without a lot of operational improvements using your existing budgets. So why would I do this? Why would I pay attention to this? Well, you don't want to waste money. You can use this as part of your capital planning. You can use it as part of your budgets. This is going to start impacting your building value. People are going to start asking about this. Banks are going to start asking about it. People who are buying buildings or looking at buildings are going to want to know how they're performing. You can compare your own properties, and you can use this as an incentive or to help your building engineers understand where they are today and ways they can improve. In fact, it can even become a friendly competition between the building engineers. It can help with leasing in some cases, ESG reporting, and investor tenant data requests. I have had tenant data requests way back in the mid 2000s from European companies they wanted to know what the carbon footprint of my building was. They needed to know that information, so we had to provide that. So it was a way to keep a tenant satisfied, and it was also a way to meet that requirement. We also have owners today we're working with who have investor data requests. They want to know what their carbon footprint is, even though it's not something they're tracking yet, but it's something we can provide. So it's something that is becoming more and more important. If the SEC regulations ever come to fruition on carbon footprint, this is something else that's going to become more and more important. So how do I use this information? As we said, maintenance and equipment decisions, your long-term goals, facility maintenance engineer performance, but also property disposition decisions. Do you want to buy a property that's poor performing and see if you can improve it? Do you want to dispose of a property that's poor performing? Or will you only buy properties that are well performing? It gives you that information you need to help do wise decisions. So, here are a couple of quick low and no costs for warehouse, office, multifamily. Replace all the fixtures, any incandescent, fluorescent. Faucet and shower aerators use less water and energy. Very easy. You can do that at turnover. Temperature set points, neither too high nor too low. Been to many a building that temperature set points in different suites were set at very high or very low levels, depending upon where people were because of complaints. And while they might have worked per se, they really were energy wasters. And there might have been other reasons for inefficiency in that system, whether it was filter replacement or anything else. So programmable thermostats and HVAC system operating hours should match the lease operating hours, and make sure your building's coming up and down in temperature when it should be. So what do I do today? Don't panic. First thing I tell everybody, start now, allow us for long-term planning now, start saving operational costs. This will increase your NOI, and you can drive the new regulations. Again, comment once those regulations come out. And finally, there are a lot of free outside resources. The DOE Better Building Solution Center has, if you're looking to do something in a building, there's probably someone who's done something similar. And to put something in the Solution Center, they actually have to put what they did, and be it a spreadsheet or lease language or an actual calculation, it is in there. And you can look for it and hopefully find what you're looking for. The database on state incentives, we can help you with that. And the Institute for Market Transformation, who kind of helps promulgate a lot of these resources, also is a good resource for looking for these things. So thank you very much. Appreciate everyone's time.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it. And thank you to all of our panelists today. We have a couple of questions in the chat that we'll bring up. We still have, looks like pretty much everybody who logged on at the outset is still with us. Looks like Dan Reddick from COP was asking about energy use data. They don't have a direct access to utility information because of the triple net leases in their portfolio. and asked about whether estimates would be allowed in lieu of actual data. I'll just, before the panelists take this one up, I'll just say that this problem was anticipated when the law passed, and there was provision put in to require disclosure and to deal with issues where the building owner is not the utility customer, isn't the account holder. Also, there were provisions in the regulations that required the utilities to do meter mapping for buildings, so that there were gaps or ghost meters in the data. That said, it's a really slippery issue that hasn't been addressed yet, but is an obvious one that needs to get resolved. With that, I'll just why don't we start with David? You didn't have a chance to respond. I think Chris and Michael did in the chat. We'll go to them in a moment.
Okay. So for buildings that have less than 4 meters, you need permission from the tenant to provide the data. We have a developer we're working with who is actually already in their rules and regulations that state that the tenants must comply with all laws, which automatically requires that tenants provide data, which is how the law is written as of right now, even though the rulemaking is not finalized. But there are also releases that we could help you develop, and they exist from the utilities to release that data. So you will need actual data from the tenants. Hopefully your building has more than 4 tenants, because they will aggregate all the data, but estimates will not work.
Chris?
I would just add,
Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just add that we're encouraging people as they renew leases to add special provisions to the lease dealing with this issue. And certainly if you have a new tenant, some attorneys are trying to look at the requirements and common in leases to comply with all laws. But look, you may be in a situation where you're telling a tenant, I need you to lower your thermostat. You can't keep it at that high number in the winter or that low a number in the summer. You're going to have the cooperation of the tenant. You need some specific language in your lease if you expect them to comply willingly or unwillingly.
Chris, anything to add?
Yeah, on the utility side, so this kind of issue came up with DC's benchmarking regulations as well. One challenge that DC worked through or is still working through, quite frankly, is very slow PEPCO response time to aggregate meter data requests. So Maryland learned from that. It's something very smart, which was put 30-day requirements into the regulation. So there's at least some teeth at the utility level, which was a very pleasant surprise. For comparison, for DC, sometimes it's taking PEPCO a couple of months to turn around aggregate meter data lists. So I think the process of getting aggregate meter information confirmed can take a little while, which is one of the reasons why I was suggesting getting started sooner rather than later. Especially for some of these utility providers that may not have had to do this really before. So, but the mechanics do exist, and not only are they in the law, they're also in the regulations. So you do have a couple of fallbacks for that. And those requirements, to be clear, are placed upon utility companies, which is a pleasant surprise.
Okay. Let's go to cost. There was a question about estimated cost, and one of the best studies that I've seen is one that Chris was on the project team in Montgomery County that looked at a number of different building types, actual building on site, cost analysis, and selected different approaches to getting to net zero carbon, which is a very close standard to what the state of Maryland is proposing. Can you give some flavor on that, Chris? And I will say before I turn it back to Chris that this subject by itself, the cost components and the potential pathways to compliance, is the subject of a future webinar by itself. And it looks like we need to add lease provisions to that too, so. Anything on
Yeah.
costs, please, Chris?
Yeah, so the study that, I mean, the very short answer is for your specific building, we don't know today. The study that Tom was describing, and I think we'll talk about this probably more at a future webinar, was kind of a high level analysis of these sorts of like deep energy retrofit work that may need to take place in the property. Those studies included some components that didn't necessarily include all components. To answer your question directly, Rear, that you just put in the chat, the answer is no, because we didn't actually have that information. Utilities require design drawings before actually being able to provide heavy up costs, and that just wasn't done as part of the study. So that piece is still outstanding. So there are pieces that just we won't necessarily have answers to today. There is a component that I would love to get, and I don't know how to do this, where we actually get more transparency from the utility companies on general ranges of, okay, what does upgrading service look like? What do those costs look like given where buildings are? That piece is missing from the market, and it's probably another really advantageous place to help answer that question. But if you're looking for general ideas, right, the studies that Tom described are a good starting space.
So those studies on the building side, so they didn't look at offsite utility costs, but on the building side, across 10, 12 building types,
it would have been
net zero cost was $25 a square foot.
Yeah, it was four building types. It was 9 buildings.
Okay.
And kind of the upgrade paths were different even across building types. Kind of the couple I can recall off the top of my head there were some that had like large scale decarbonization projects needed to take place. Some were able to get to those targets by mostly optimization. One actually we did an alternative for one of them where we just put in a whole bunch of solar because Montgomery County allowed us to do that. I was curious, quite frankly, to see if that was what reach Montgomery County BEPS. But there are going to be different pathways potentially. But yeah.
So one of the challenges with the state's approach to this is their cost information and their forecasting of practicality and technical feasibility is based on kind of desktop computer modeling, not actual case studies. And the Montgomery County approach was actual case studies that were in the $25 a square foot range across a wide variety of different building conditions. It had, as Chris said, some range to it. So that's the best answer that we can give today to that question. And again, it doesn't include the offsite utility upgrades that might be necessary. Anything else on cost from David or Michael?
My only recommendation is, as you go forward, make sure it's in your capital planning, whatever you need to do. I saw there was a question about Class C buildings and people leaving Maryland. That's something you should reflect to your legislatures. If you feel that this is impacting your buildings to that point, that businesses are going to leave, let them know.
Yeah, and I will add that Tom, on behalf of NAIOP, and I, on behalf of the home builders and NAIOP, testified that we believe that many buildings will simply not find it cost effective to comply with these requirements. The problem is the statute pushes the state down this path, but we're very concerned about the impact of this on commercial real estate in this state.
Yeah, I think the question of obsolescence in some buildings and building types is a huge one. And even new construction or relatively new construction may have a difficult time meeting some of the proposed targets.
Actually,
the timeline that's available.
Can I pop in with a couple of things?
Sure.
Also, so I mentioned earlier about the idea of like getting an assessment started to get some bounds around what might your upgrade cost look like. This is part of the reason why, honestly. Like having as much of a runway as possible to figure out, like, okay, is this going to be feasible? Is this not necessarily going to be feasible? is like, that is going to be key. And you don't want to leave that until the end and then find out like, oh, I can't do this, or oh, I can do this. And you want to know, and you want to have while we have to some extent a little bit of luxury of time, let's use it. The other piece is in both DC and Montgomery County BEPS in different ways. They have allowed for provisions around cost feasibility. So there are some examples in the region, again, the mechanics look a little bit different depending on where you are, that do speak to some of the cost feasibility questions. So it wouldn't surprise me to see them propagate in Maryland at some point, because we have references for it.
Okay, seems like we still have a pretty strong group online. I'm going to go until 10:30, and then we'll take questions by email at that point. Does NIAP have lease language? We don't do that. It's really not our expertise to provide lease provisions, but there may be other sources to do that. Attorneys in the market or other sources, and we'll look into that and let the panelists reply.
Yeah, there's the Better Building Challenge. Actually, if you look up lease language, you can find lease language from Prologis. Actually, they provided that's online, and also IMT, their website has lease language. I have a whole guide on green leasing that has everything, but includes lease language for electrical, for utility data. So, and as I said, one developer we're working with already has in their rules and regs and their leases that you must comply with all laws and regulations, and they're using that and going straight to their tenants with that, and haven't had any pushback yet.
Michael, you mentioned you're advising your clients on lease provisions.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just the reporting requirements, right? As I said, you're going to have to make changes to the building in order to meet the site energy use intensity or the direct greenhouse gas reductions. You don't want to just have an argument about whether a particular requirement is required by law, or whether you're doing it now because you don't want to put in a fossil fuel system that you're going to have to pull in 5 years. So you need to start putting clauses in your leases. And by the way, this includes when you're doing due diligence on a building, right? You need to look at the lease that the existing tenant has, and what is that tenant's rights if you take over as landlord and suddenly discover that you're subject to $25,000 a day penalties if you fail to upgrade the building.
Anything to add, Chris?
No, not really.
Okay.
Honestly, David recommended the resources that I would think of to get started from. Again, we'll get, and if you're looking for a starting point, those are good references. I'd imagine that may need to adjust them slightly. I guess the other piece that I want to point out, this is kind of something, again, we're pulling from DC. There was some adjustment in how the alternative compliance payments, what the name of them were, basically. Because I think the current name didn't allow for pass-through, but a modification on the name would allow for pass-through. I don't know the specifics of that, quite frankly. If you have DC folk that are engaged with the DC BEPS task force, they can talk to the specifics a little bit more. Yeah. But like that mechanic does exist, because there was a question about pass-throughs also.
Right. So that was the next question about, yeah, whether if tenants don't comply, who's responsible. I mentioned before the provision that's supposed to deal with situations where the tenant is responsible for utilities and even mechanical equipment. But application of that hasn't happened yet, and it's not clear. The fines themselves or the alternative compliance penalties are misaligned in those situations, because they apply to the building owner, and clarifying how that could be passed through or done as a pass through, or applying them directly to the responsible party is an important clarification.
Yeah, Michael, I don't know if you know anything about specific language terminology around that. It was something that came up in the DC task force that as I recall, people had very strong opinions about, but it was kind of like a little bit outside of my range, but it's kind of a
Yeah,
language requirement.
the
So-
pass-through is going to depend. I mean, what it's coming down to right now, if you have an old lease, if it's not one that's been rewritten within the last month or so by somebody who knows what they're doing, then you're going to be looking at language that wasn't intended for this situation and trying to make it fit. It's a square peg in a round hole. And some people are looking at leases that say the tenant is responsible for any violations of law and say, well, if you, the tenant, caused us to violate the law, then we can pass the fine on to you. The problem, of course, is that's subject to interpretation, and you don't want to end up fighting over those issues with your tenants. So that's the reason to try to get clarity, at least in your leases, that whatever BEPS requires you to do, the tenant has to give you their full and complete cooperation. And if they fail to, then they're responsible for any fines that you pay as a result.
So I'm going to grab one more question and then we'll sign off quickly. There was a question in the chat about refreshing our memory on the industrial building exemption. Manufacturing, it's narrower than you would want and narrower and not as clear as you would expect, right? The regulation applied that manufacturing exemption to buildings that had a use class within the building that's industrial within the American Industry of Classification System, NAICS. So it's basically an internal use, not the building type or zoning. So that could move out of the building potentially, right? And there's a lot of room for clarification on what the industrial exemption would be within BEPS. And there's also overall change in the works to the industrial exemption from the state's overall climate policies.
Yeah, as Tom knows, I actually wrote that statute years ago, and it's not an exemption for industrial companies or an exemption for industrial use. It's an exemption for manufacturing, not even manufacturer. So it's not as broad as you might hope. The office space of McCormick is not manufacturing. So and as Tom said, it's being re-examined.
Any last words on those issues, David or Chris? Okay, well, thank you again to our panelists, and for those of you who attended, please forward questions directly to me, and we will get them to the panelists for posting. I think all the meeting materials will be posted. You'll have an opportunity to access the slide decks and other material and download them if you wish to do that. So again, thank you all very much. Have a great day.
Bom Dios.